Uh, where was I? Good morning. Um, Today we have, as a lot of you already know, Jim Burklo. Jim has been coming here for what, about 15, 20 years almost, I suppose it is.
Yes, 16, 17 years, long
Yeah,
time.
right. One of my favorite sermons that he gave was a poem that lasted about 20 minutes, as I recall. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I had some fun with that. That
It was like Dr. Zeus kind of a
Dr.
poem.
Simi type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Long time.
Anyway, he is a very creative speaker and thinker, and as you also may know, he was at USC for several years as the associate dean of religious and spiritual life for the students. Uh, he left there about 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and
Yeah.
moved to Ojai of all places. He has a donkey farm up there. Well, he's got some land and two donkeys, and he is also a half-time pastor at the UCC Church of Simi Valley, and he's also involved as, I think, associate director of an organization that works with progressive Christianity on college campuses, where he, I think, talks and recruits and maybe helps progressive chaplains and in universities and colleges. We asked Jim to come today to talk just a little bit about the state of progressive Christianity. Um, he's been involved in that, and there's a national organization called, I believe it's called Progressive Christianity, and he's been involved in that. So, Jim, welcome, and here you go.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone. It's glad to be back with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. This business of being a pastor is really a problem on Sundays. You know, you can only be in one place. So I miss you all. Really have enjoyed our connection all these years. So today I'm talking about the current state of progressive Christianity in its historical context, and look forward to a conversation with you too. So we'll leave plenty of time for back and forth. A little bit about what I'm up to, my own relationship to the movement at this point. So my last years at USC as the Senior Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life there, the Interfaith Center for the campus chaplain's office, I began to put together a national network of progressive Christian campus ministries. The Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopal, etc., churches, the denominations have networks of campus ministries, but the trouble with them is that they're big tents. They include evangelical Christians as well as progressives, which is fine. It's just that if you're a student and you're looking for a progressive, specifically progressive campus ministry that's overtly LGBTQ plus friendly, which is kind of the bright line for a lot of students, they're hard to find. It's hard to find one because denominational identity doesn't mean anything anymore. Nobody can spell Presbyterian, and students think Methodist is some kind of chiropractic treatment. And Episcopal, that doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything to anybody. And so because I was in that world of campus ministry for many years, I realized we had a problem as far as branding and students being able to find ministries that were appropriate for them. So I started this thing called Zoe, Progressive Christian Life on Campus, and now it is the main project of Progressive Christians Uniting.org, which you might be familiar with. It's been in Southern California for about 25 years, and started by George Regas and John Cobb, the famous process theologian. I know a bunch of you read his work. Might be familiar with process theology. So now Zoe is the one and only real project of Progressive Christians Uniting, and I'm the executive director as a volunteer, and it's off and running. The other main figure in this operation is Brian McLaren. People familiar with him? Yeah, some hands are waving. Yeah, Brian and I really, he got involved in it shortly after I got this thing started, and he's on the board, and he's a very, very active and strong supporter of what we're trying to do. And I think what's going on in the campus ministry world with the work we're doing is emblematic of the larger picture of the historical moment of progressive Christianity in America and around the world. And that is that progressive Christianity has really kind of come into its own as an identity, recognizable by a lot of people, more and more people. And I think it might help to understand all this if we go back in history, do a flash history lesson about progressive Christianity. And I thought I would bring with me a prop. This is a really old book. Let's see, what is it here? 1883. Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions, being a comparison of the Old and New Testament myths and miracles with those of heathen nations of antiquity, considering also their origins and meanings. So this is an old book, kind of fallen apart. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is that progressive Christianity is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time in various forms, but the general gist of it, the basics of it, go way back. One way of measuring it and declaring the original date, you might say, is 1651. That's when the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes declared that the books of Moses could not have been written by Moses, which should be self-evident because they make reference to his death. So, there's that. But at the time, that was a pretty radical statement. And then, of course, he's raising the question of okay, who did write the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures? Who did write them, and how? And that question was pursued by biblical scholars who were beginning to apply the understandings of emergent science, the scientific enterprise, was starting to be applied to the study of religion, and specifically the Bible itself. Whole new thing, right? To use those methods to study the Scripture. And that led to the discovery in the 18th century of what's now called the documentary hypothesis. And that was the idea proposed by a German biblical scholar, Wellhausen, who said that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures originally were 4 different versions of those stories that then were conflated and edited in together, which is why we have 2 creation stories, right? And a couple different versions of the 10 Commandments, or the laws of Israel. They were conflated. So there were this got started in Germany. That's where biblical criticism, textual historical criticism, was born, spread to Britain, and came to America. And the people who embraced this idea, who embraced this growing awareness that the Scripture was written by people with axes to grind, right, and perspectives based on their historical circumstances, the people who embraced this began to embrace the idea that the Bible should not be taken in a historically literal manner, but should be understood in more of a mythical manner. And those who embraced this perspective were really leaders and important preachers in the what are now the mainline Protestant churches. So it was a pretty mainstream point of view, but there's also a very strong reaction to that, right? A rejection of this idea. And the nature of that rejection, ironically, embraced the scientific idea, right? And the whole idea of history as a matter of fact, facts that could be verified through some kind of a scientific, if you will, method of inquiry. So that's where we got fundamentalism. In the medieval era, the ancient through the medieval era, the least interesting way to read the Bible was to read it literally, right? People did not care about reading the Bible literally. That wasn't interesting to them. They didn't argue with it being literally factually true, but they weren't interested much in that way of interpreting it. They looked at the Bible as a resource provided by God for us to express and explore our spiritual journeys, right? All sorts of evidence. That's the way Jesus interpreted the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. That's the way the early Christians interpreted it all the way through the medieval era. Then we get to Wellhausen, and we get to this new perspective, and the reaction to that made a new claim that had never really been made before, and that was that the Bible is historically factual in the modern sense of what historical factuality is, right? And that became fundamentalism, which was codified later in a text called the Fundamentals. That's where we get the idea of fundamentalism. That term came from a book that was assembled that was a reaction to the theory of evolution, the historical critical approach to scripture, and the interpretation of the Christian scriptures as being not so much historical as mythical and spiritual in nature. So you get the Fundamentals, published in 1910 in America, and that's when we get the hardening and the organizing, if you will, of the fundamentalist Christian movement. Meanwhile, again, mainline Protestants, many of them, not all of them, but many, had embraced this new approach of understanding Scripture, embodied in this book and many others back in the 1800s and into the 20th century. And that grew and spread. And then you have this reaction from the fundamentalists. And then you have the Scopes monkey trial, right? 1925, William Jennings Bryant versus Clarence Darrow, right? Arguing about 6-day creationism versus the theory of evolution. The evolution perspective was lost the legal case, but won in the court of public opinion in the mainstream media, right? And fundamentalists were kind of put into the category of a backwater, backwards-looking, primitive sort of cultural phenomenon. And there was a certain quiescence to that movement, right? They began to create their own world of resources and media and books and networks of churches and preachers. So they were building a strong subculture, but it was a subculture that was considered kind of backward and backwoodsy kind of thing, right? Not mainstream culture of the country. Then you get FDR, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, which, in retrospect, I think you and I in this group would look back and say, that actually saved America from communism, right? Because people were so angry about what the capitalists had done to the country in the Great Depression that they were ready for some major change. So FDR brought us the New Deal, and the reaction to that was fierce also from the right, political right, particularly the moneyed class, the corporate interests, really were upset about this. And they realized that a way to fight back against what they thought of as socialism and their idea of what communism was in America, but the way to fight back was to make a cultural alliance of Christians with capitalists. And so they formed a movement, a coalition to promote that. And the irony of it is that the pastor who was the leader of this thing, along with oil industry executives and big shots of, titans of industry, was a guy named Fifield, who was the pastor of First Congregational Los Angeles. And Fifield was a theologically progressive Christian, right? So he embraced all this scholarship of Wellhausen and the historical critical approach and the mythical understanding of the scripture. He embraced all that, but he was fiercely anti-communist, fiercely Republican, conservative guy, right? So they put this coalition together, and it became a pretty powerful force, and that's when corporate money started going into evangelical, into fundamentalist Christianity. And that movement built up. And then in the 50s, you got this coalition chose Billy Graham as their champion, right? And they rebranded fundamentalism as evangelical Christianity because it sounded better, it seemed less threatening or backwards. And he was a gifted orator, and he could kind of bridge the cultural gap between the fundamentalist South and the industrialized North. He was able to kind of bridge those cultural divides. And so those crusades were bankrolled up the yin yang because corporate America was behind Billy Graham to fight communism, right, and to prevent atheist socialism from dominating the country. So that's when you got the full flowering of this alliance, which then kept going and growing and really got going in the public sphere when the Bob Jones decision was made in the 1980s, when Fundamentalist College was denied federal student aid because the college refused to accept, miscegenation, right? Blacks and whites dating and getting married and hooking up, etc. So they were so against that. But then the government said, well, if you're not going to allow marriage freedom, then you're not going to get federal aid from us. And they howled in fury, and that got them politically activated. That united the racist elements of fundamentalist white Christianity with the political right in a very powerful movement that then became the religious right as we know it today. So that's some history. Meanwhile, us, I say us because the United Church of Christ certainly is in that category, mainline Protestants who had embraced generally this more historical critical approach to Scripture and had a broadly more progressive view of politics and social relationships and women's rights and workers' rights, etc., carried on and kind of with an assumption that we were kind of the dominant force in the social, the national expression of Christianity. And a kind of a certain complacency had kicked in by that point. But then our churches started declining precipitously. evangelical churches, fundamentalists, same thing really, started growing rapidly with this tremendous infusion of corporate money, big business money pouring in to the churches and their institutions. Just to give you a little feel for how that has resulted today, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is an evangelical network of campus ministries around the country, has a budget of something like $90 million a year. Our Zoe network has a budget of $20,000 a year. So there's the difference, right? Focus on the Family, a gigantic enterprise. It's big fundy. You know, you've heard of it's the fundamentalist industrial complex, the pinnacle of its organizational structure. Focus on the Family, 100 million a year plus, and on the progressive side is a little outfit that Brian McLaren started called Raising Kids for Good, 100% volunteer organization. I think its budget is maybe $5,000 a year. That's the difference, right? The institutional structures are so different. Now, of course, on the progressive side, our denominations have all sorts of resources, right? You know, thousands of churches and billions of dollars when you add it all up. But they've been in decline for a long time. And also they're big tents. So our denominations, Presbyterian, Methodist, United Church, even the UCC, which is less so today, almost all the conservative folks, theologically conservative folks that used to be in the United Church of Christ have left. They're gone, right? So it's pretty much uniformly become a more progressive denomination in every way, theologically as well as socially. But my point is that the denominations were kind of big tents, and as a result, trying to keep too many people happy, right? And that has not worked out well for any of our denominations. Into this mix, in this period of decline, and kind of arm waving and hand wringing by mainline Protestants about their fate compared to the ascendance of evangelical Christianity in the 80s and 90s. Into this mix came Bishop Spong. You're all familiar with him, right? Yay. And he revived an idea from 1963. Maybe y'all read "Honest to God" by Robinson, the Episcopal bishop. Robinson just put out there, he says, look, let's just be honest about the fact that we don't believe in a supernatural God anymore. Right? Revolutionary in 1963, kind of had its moment as a cultural phenomenon. But then you had this ascendance of evangelical Christianity and this descent of the mainline. And then Spong came along and said the same thing, but as an act, he's a very visible cultural presence and got a lot of media attention and a lot of condemnation, of course, from evangelical Christians. Also, a lot of condemnation from the more theologically conservative wings of the Christian denominations. But he got attention. He put into words what so many people were feeling and thinking in our more progressive churches, and really crystallized a way of talking about that perspective about Christianity. Not long after he became a thing, Reverend Jim Adams, who was the pastor of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., retired after many years of preaching Robinson and Spong's theology. And he created a statement and an organization, Progressive Christianity, the Center for Progressive Christianity originally. Now it's just known as progressivechristianity.org, right? So he started this. He came up with an 8-point welcome statement that succinctly, clearly, and simply described what progressive Christianity is. And he gave it this title, this name, this term, progressive Christianity. And it caught on quickly. Shortly after he founded it, I got real excited when I heard about it and signed up my church in San Mateo UCC Church there right away to be one of the affiliate congregations. And then I wrote a book about progressive Christianity, and one thing led to another, and then I found myself on the board of directors of progressivechristianity.org for about 10 years, and I'm still an honorary advisor for that group. What we did was to make progressive Christianity an identity. So the ideas behind it are old news, right? And, there were other terms bandied around that related to this, like, liberal Protestants, etc., liberal Protestant, mainline, right? But the term progressive, and to give it a definition, a clear picture of what that means, again, not, taking the Bible seriously because we don't take it literally, all of it. Full 100% inclusion of queer people and ordaining queer people, full inclusion. Focus on social justice, a focus on compassion, and just making that succinct in this 8-point welcome statement really crystallized a lot of people's ideas about this and got them excited. And the churches began to use the term progressive Christianity as they affiliated with this it's not a denomination. Progressivechristianity.org is not a denomination. It's just a world, an association, if you will, of churches that identify with it. So this spread, it grew, and at first, the identity of progressive Christianity was sort of in opposition to evangelical Christianity. We're the other Christians, right? There's what people think of when they think of Christianity, which is evangelical Christianity, and then there's us. We're the alternative to that, and in opposition to that in a lot of ways. So, our role was to kind of, at first, was sort of to blow a hole in the side of the battleship of evangelical Christianity. And we got a lot of play for that, even though our numbers are small and our resources are tiny, minuscule. The annual budget today of progressivechristianity.org is about $250,000. Compare that to Focus on the Family and a zillion other evangelical entities that are just fantastically funded. But with this tiny, with our tiny resources and our shrimpy numbers, we've been able to do a lot, actually. I'm kind of boggled by how effective we've been. So we started out being kind of oppositional, but then it's sort of like I was part of this, watching this emerge in our movement. As people realized, hello, it's like, if we want to go anywhere with this, we've got to be positive. We have to offer a positive alternative. It's a viable alternative form of Christianity for the country and the world. And that means new hymns, rewritten old hymns. That's something you're probably familiar with. I've done a bunch of that myself. New words for old hymns, theologically progressive lingo that goes into beautiful old songs. New liturgical material, new liturgies, prayers, etc. And then resources for adult study and for children. we have a long way to go with resources for kids. And that's what this new group called Raising Kids for Good, RFKG. Good stuff cooking there, but just at the inception. So we began to develop resources, and that has grown tremendously. And if you go to progressivechristianity.org and you go to resources, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's huge. And it was nothing 25 years ago, 28 years ago. So we've made a lot of progress. And again, it's all explicitly theologically and socially progressive. Now, again, our denominations have struggled with this problem because, again, they're trying to be big tents to include people with a more evangelical persuasion, pastors, churches, and members. But we have been specifically progressive. So we have acted really in the service of the progressive wings of the denominations, working alongside them. We're not in opposition to them in any way. We're working with them. And the result has been, a lot of very fruitful collaboration and connection. And that has continued. So the state of affairs now. So again, the word progressive Christian, it was kind of an underground thing, not that well known until 2004. And that is when Jim Wallace, founder of Sojourners in DC, which is theologically conservative but socially liberal, politically liberal organization. He was interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR, and she referred to him as a progressive Christian, which made all of us in leadership in this movement very upset at first because he was not theologically progressive at all, and he was not gay-friendly at all at the time. We finally, much later, switched on that. He's now queer-friendly, queer-affirming. But we were appalled, but at the same time, we realized this is the first time that the term progressive Christianity has made it to NPR. And then it got more and more use after that, much more use in the public sphere. What is happening now is that in the last several years, evangelical Christianity has begun to decline precipitously, particularly during and after COVID. The membership took a dive. And that really has freaked out evangelical Christian, fundamentalist Christian leadership around the country. They are really worried that they're going down. And of course, that just amplifies their lingo around spiritual warfare, right? That we're contending against the spiritual forces of the air, right? And they've doubled down on this spiritual warfare rhetoric, which is scary actually, because it, as we have seen in Minnesota recently, bleeds over into actual warfare. So they're using that rhetoric more because they're threatened by their loss of traction in the culture, their loss of status in the country, and particularly with young people. Precipitous decline of young people being involved in any kind of religion. And one of the consequences of this decline is that they're looking for people to blame, and one of their favorite groups to blame is us, you. They're blaming you, right? They're blaming progressive Christians for stealing their sheep and leading their sheep astray. And they're making this statement in very threatening and scary terms. Again, spiritual warfare against you and I. And so there's this whole wing of evangelical Christianity that's called the apologetics movement. Apologetics is the effort to rationally argue in favor of believing the tenets of the faith. Right? It's been a thing for a long time, but now it's a big deal, And one of the big obsessions of the apologetics movement in evangelical Christianity is us, is attacking our theology. Ironically, this has been the best publicity that the progressive Christian movement has ever had. And when we get to a little discussion here, I would like to know if you know any folks who've drifted into your church lately because they heard about us via fundamentalists decrying us, and they go, "Oh, maybe I should check out these people that my preachers are warning me against. That sounds actually kind of good, you know?" So that's happening. Here at UCC Simi, we've had people showing up at our church because they realize we're the alternative to this stuff that they've been. And Trumpism, of course, the advent of Donald Trump had a big negative effect on evangelical churches. A lot of people are like, okay, I'm done. I can't do it. If my church is going to endorse this godless monster, then bye-bye, I'm out of here. So we've had an influx in our progressive Christian churches of ex-evangelicals, and this has been going on for years. Now, 15 years ago, there was this movement called emergent Christianity, and that consisted of disaffected evangelicals and fundamentalists who were looking for another way, but they were not ready to embrace progressive Christianity. They just were looking for a kinder, gentler, meeker version of evangelical Christianity. But pretty much everybody in that movement, Brian McLaren, my good friend and colleague, was the leader of that movement, right? And over time, Brian and his movement became progressive Christians, because where else were they going to go in the end? It was only going to go in one direction. So that brought a lot of folks into our fold. And what's interesting, this is what's going on now, is we have ex-evangelicals checking out our churches, and some of our progressive churches have been savvy enough to welcome this group by changing our worship services and bringing in music and liturgy that sounds familiar to evangelicals, but with progressive content. So if you go to the Claremont United Church of Christ, our UCC there, they have done this. They were doing praise music in their worship service, but the kind of praise music that translates well for progressives. But when ex-evangelicals show up, they feel like they're being received, like they're being honored, or, they can connect with that when they come in. So right now, the current state of things is we have a big group of ex-evangelical people leaving evangelical land, looking for an alternative, and tentative about what we're about, unfamiliar with our liturgies and our ways of doing worship, the old mainline style worship. So the more we can do to accommodate those folks without, of course, abandoning our commitments, our theological and social commitment, the more we can do to make them feel welcome, the better for them and the better for our churches. And that's happening all over the country, and that's a major development. And with these folks comes energy and gifts and skills. All that earnest, sincere, evangelical, cultural energy is showing up at our doors. Can we welcome it? Can we encourage it? Can we incorporate it into the lives of our churches? Something I observed personally that is a real problem, and that is that our denominations are so stuck in their ways that they're really not able in any meaningful way to welcome evangelical pastors into our fold. I just very recently got done with a 6-year process. Took 6 years for a young friend of mine who's a military chaplain. He came up through the fundamentalist system of ordaining, of registering, certifying chaplains, but he's gave up that theology a long time ago. He's 100% progressive Christian, but it took 6 years to get this guy to be an ordained United Church of Christ military chaplain. Ridiculous. Okay. Another guy that I was close to, Seventh-day Adventist pastor, brilliant preacher, built up a huge church in Hollywood, brilliant leader, got thrown out of the SDA church because he was in favor of gay marriage, right? So I sit down with him and I go, dude, we're going to make you UCC. Let's get busy with that. So I call up our denominational folks. Roadblock, roadblock, roadblock. Forget about it. This guy had to, feed a family. He needed a job. Brilliant, perfectly, the perfect UCC ministerial candidate. Forget about it. Too hard to make the switch. So our institutional structures of our denominations, even as our denominations are becoming more and more progressive as the evangelicals leave them, we're still stuck with these old, creaky, slow systems. And that's a real impediment to taking advantage of this huge exodus of brilliant, skilled people from evangelical land. We got to fix this problem. So don't get me started on this topic. Anyway, so we're in this really interesting state. This is a moment for us to seize. Right? We need to seize the moment. And the other moment, and part of seizing the moment is losing our inhibitions about politics. Okay? Donald J. Trump is a threat to democracy. Donald J. Trump is a threat to freedom. And with that freedom that is threatened is the freedom of religion, the freedom of the free exercise of our faith. And the folks running our country now are guided by Christian dominionism. Okay, there are a bunch of folks in positions of high leadership of our country who believe in theocracy. And it's scary and it's unacceptable. And it is also unacceptable for us to be quiet about it. Right? So that means doing things that we're not comfy doing. Saying things that we're not comfy saying. But if we get bold and say it and do it, we're going to get two things. We're going to get more members. People are going to show up at our door because we took a stand. And we're going to be part of the movement to save this country from fascism. Okay? We're going to do that. We can do our part to fight fascism in America. There's this thing called the Johnson Amendment. Makes us nervous, right? Says that if you, talk partisan politics and, advocate for candidates for office or against them in a church, you'll lose your nonprofit status. That is out the window, right? It's out the window because, 3/4 of the fundamentalist churches, evangelical churches in America have endorsed Donald J. Trump with no consequences, right? And it will be pretty tough, even under Trump, for the IRS to enforce that rule as long as these churches, so many of them, are doing this. So, they have no inhibitions about doing this, and we shouldn't have the inhibitions either about taking a stand here to fight fascism. And I think the churches that are being upfront about this are picking up members because people are looking for the alternative. In front of my church right now is a sign that says, picture of a heart, says, "Love melts ice." And then I've had another sign up that says, "We are the Christian resistance to tyranny," in orange. Okay. Um, I make the signs myself. We don't have a budget for this, so I've become a pretty good sign maker. Okay. But it works, right? People see the signs and they show up. Okay. And the problem that we still have in this country is that when people drive by most progressive churches, even now, after all our efforts to convince people otherwise, people are still shy about putting up signage that indicates exactly where we're at. Okay. And the consequences of that is that, people drive by a church that just says congregational church, they think, oh, fundamentalists, right? They don't know. They can't spell congregational, you know. United Church of Christ, that's an oxymoron, right? We have more people coming to our church thinking that we're Church of Christ, which is fundamentalist, than thinking that we're United Church of Christ, right? So our denominational labels mean zip, mean nothing. And if you want people to know who you are, you have to put up a pride flag in front of your church. We have a pride flag in front of our church here all the time. I buy them in bulk because every one that I put up in front of the church gets stolen right away. We've lost like 40 of them, right? But I buy them in bulk and I keep putting them up because that's how people know that we're different, right? So we're in a very special historical moment. People know who we are now. Many more Americans know that there's such a thing as progressive Christianity today than they did even 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Certainly, many more than they did when we started progressivechristianity.org 28 years ago. But we have a long way to go, and it's going to require us losing our inhibitions about putting out there what makes us distinctive and different. I'm done. Let's have a convo here while we can. Questions, comments, please.
We need to use the microphone here, so I'll run around here.
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Jim. This was really wonderful. I have a question about another type of Christianity you did not mention, and that's Catholicism. You talked about the desire for a theocracy. It seems to me that all the theocrats on the Supreme Court are Catholics. And nonetheless, this doesn't sit very well with their denomination. For instance, the late Pope and hopefully the new Pope, they're really proponents of social justice. I mean, Catholicism for me is an incredible contradiction in terms of its political face. And maybe you could say a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, it's what's going on inside Protestantism in terms of the divide between fundamentalist and more progressive. Same thing is happening inside the Catholic Church, right? And we find allies, Catholic allies, all the time for our progressive Christian movement, which is generally Protestant. But we include Catholics, and more Catholic folks are working with us. You guys familiar with Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R? Any hands? Check him out, R-O-H-R, Center for Contemplation and Action in Albuquerque. He is a really smart guy. He's a brilliant interpreter of the Christian contemplative tradition, which, by the way, I'm deep into, as you know, which is becoming a much bigger deal in progressive Christianity. The meditative contemplative tradition of Christianity is taking deep root in progressive Christianity. It's always been there in the Catholic Church, and what Rohr is doing is popularizing it for everybody, Catholics, Protestants, and others. So he's a great example of a kind of, he doesn't put out there that he's progressive about anything. But if you read his stuff, you go, oh yeah. this guy's a universalist, he's a progressive, totally, but he couches everything he says in traditional Orthodox language. Smart guy, awesome guy. There's a whole world of Catholics like that. Catholics that'll show up at a monastery for a retreat, but they don't go to Mass anymore because they're hearing stuff they don't want to put up with anymore. But again, it depends on what parish you're in, right? You can go to Santa Monica, St. Monica's in Santa Monica, and you get one version of Catholicism. You go to the Catholic campus ministry at USC, which is run by an Opus Dei guy, priest. Totally different message, right? All in the same Catholic Church. So, yeah, I think we all need to be, aware and sensitive to the complexities there and to the diversity. Catholic means universal, right? So everything is in there. Lots of different perspectives within Catholicism. So I think lifting up and honoring the more progressive threads in the Catholic Church is a really important thing. And I think for example, Brian McLaren is on the board of the Center for Action and Contemplation, right? Ex-evangelical progressive Christian. So a lot of connections have been made. Thank you for that, bringing that up. Others?
I was wondering about when you were mentioning the Supreme Court, it seems as though every once in a while Comey Barrett, who I believe is Catholic, has definitely put at least somewhat of a progressive stamp on some of the decisions, and baby steps, yes, very baby steps, but giving me much more hope than when she got confirmed.
Yeah, well, she's still an institutionalist. She still believes in the United States Constitution. Fancy that. She believes in the separation of powers, and she's a defender of democracy, even though the decisions she's been making we're really unhappy about, a lot of them. At the root, she's still, is against autocracy and tyranny. So that's good. We'll celebrate that. And this is the thing, things are not all cut and dried and simple across these lines. And there's still fundamentalist evangelical Christians who are politically more progressive. There's a bunch of them, and our movement works with them quite smoothly. And the Black church, things are complicated in the historically Black churches, many of which are not gay friendly, but they're definitely defenders of the governmental safety net, social and health safety net, and they're defenders of the rights of Black people, right, and their interests. So you see people like William Barber, who's a terrific advocate for social justice and for preserving our social safety net. He is not some firebrand on the theological front at all. He's definitely a progressive Christian when it comes to the social issues. So
he's UCC too, isn't he?
Well, he's disciples of Christ. I think he might have a UCC connection, but I think he's disciples. But there's, there's a lot of allyship going on here across the movement, and I would just say the leadership of progressive Christianity in the country is not, theologically dogmatic. This is an issue that we dealt with early. Hi, sorry, excuse me. I'll be on. My church people. There's a lot of cross-fertilization across lines that might have been more distinct in the past. A lot of cooperation and collaboration. And again, as the denominations, like the Methodists just had a split, right? So the Methodist Church is going to be mostly progressive from here on out. Most of the evangelicals in the Episcopal Church have left and joined the Anglican Communion, conservative group. Now the question is whether the denominations can, adjust to this new reality in an intelligent way, and I question whether they can. It's sort of a new wine in the old wineskins problem. I'm going to General Synod this summer. I'm not terribly excited about it, I must admit. Is the denomination's stuck in the past? It's like it's a new day. The denominational identity is meaningless, absolutely meaningless. And I give you an example. Is like, what's the the tagline for the United Church of Christ is God is still speaking, right? In about 5 miles from where I sit here today is a church called God Speak. Is that a UCC church? No. It is a hyper fundamentalist, hardcore Trumper church. Right? People hear the tagline, God is still speaking, and they think, oh, God still is against abortion and homosexuality. Right? So, we're all in the UCC, we talk insider baseball. It's like our own head trip about what we think. We have lingo that we understand among ourselves, but it doesn't mean anything to people outside of the United Church of Christ. And all the denominations are stuck in that mess. So that's why groups like progressivechristianity.org had to be created to be a different, to have a platform to get across a specifically progressive message. Same with the Zoe Project, same thing. We're not against the denominations. We're just trying to help them, help them make the transition to the new reality. Sorry, I kind of drifted away there from the topic. Others?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to try to make it simple. This whole question of God is speaking to me and telling me this, and God is speaking to him and telling him something exactly opposite. And I think that's been true of Christianity since the very get-go. The scary thing to me was a Trump statement last night.
Yeah.
That is something to the effect that God had led him into this bombing.
Oh, Lord. Yeah.
And thankfulness to God for leading him there because he knew it was the right way. That is really scary. And I'm wondering if we'll ever get away from this split of God is telling me to do this and telling him to do something else.
Good question. I don't know what it's going to take, but if I don't see this turning out very well with Iran, right? I don't see this being a neat and tidy affair any more than it was when George Bush declared victory in Iraq, before another 15 years of mayhem. And then you start asking, maybe God really didn't want it that way, and all this God talk about how God spared Donald J. Trump from being killed by that bullet. It's like, well, did God intend for the other guy that the bullet hit to be killed by that bullet? It's like, all that language begs the questions, right? But who's asking the questions? So yeah, we just it's it's a mess. Yeah, no news, right?
I've got a question, Jim. This is Rich. How do you react to something that a friend of mine, I think, has said to me, not quite this specifically, but that progressive Christianity and other ways by which the traditional Christianity has kind of diminished, so to speak, is just a last gasp. In other words, those, I think you want to tell me those ministers that they're still part of the church, but they really don't believe what they think. It's just, what are they doing? Why don't they become social workers or something like that?
Well, I think that is the attitude that evangelicals, fundamentalists had about progressive Christianity 10 years ago and earlier. We go, oh, who cares about those turkeys? They're all dying off. Nobody cares about them. They're just, silly apostates who are, on the way out. They don't say that anymore. Now they're saying that we are stealing their sheep and that we are a mortal threat to their churches. As if, we had any power. I just think it's wonderful. If these guys had any idea how wimpy our institutions are, maybe they wouldn't be saying this stuff, but apparently they haven't read the balance sheets of our organizations. But I think what's really interesting is that we have, in fact, as a matter of fact, we have a whole bunch of flourishing progressive churches out there that are growing and strong. And of course, we've got lots of little progressive churches that carry on, like the one I'm in now. It's like, yeah, we're small, but we're strong. We carry on. We're doing it. We're still being a witness in the community, just like ever. So the fact is that there will always be a niche for us, progressive Christians, to fill. And I think there are all sorts of institutionally creative ways of doing that, besides just Sunday morning with the preacher, same guy or gal every week talking. There are other models of how to do this. House churches, retreat centers, more episodic relationship. This is the thing. In the Catholic Church, millions of Catholics have an episodic relationship to Catholicism. That is, they show up for stuff, but they don't come to Mass every Sunday. Us guys in the Protestant progressive world need to do the same thing. We need to create a whole universe of events, programs, retreats, and happenings that are episodic to give people access to our spirituality and our tradition without having to do the usual church thing, right? The Sunday morning church thing. So we're thriving and surviving. Evangelicals think that we're a lot bigger deal than we are, right? They used to laugh at us, and now they're scared of us. I mean, Billy Graham's daughter says that the progressive Christian movement is of Satan, Satan's instrument, right? Wow. Okay. So I'm not worried about the survival of the progressive Christian movement at all. We're gonna, we'll be okay. Yes, a lot of our churches are dying out. Same thing's happening in the Southern Baptist Church, right? Membership in the Southern Baptist Church is going down. That doesn't mean that evangelical Christianity is dying out completely, far from it. But this is across the board, cultural change.
Okay. Anyone else? We got one more person who wants to ask a question. Any more else? Anyone else? Okay. Sheila.
Is there a particular philosophy about communion in this progressive movement?
I think there's a lot of room for interpretation. No, there's no fixed dogma about that at all. There's no fixed dogma at all, right? Just a little background. We have these 8 points that we had originally for the welcome statement, and we made a point of changing them every so often so that they would not become a dogma, right? And, at one point we were voting on changing the welcome statement. Somebody says, but people, they expect us to have this statement. It's like, that's who we are. That's what defines us. And then we're all, we're thinking about that and we kind of go, wait a minute, this is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So yeah, there's no fixed dogma about communion. And I think, this is me talking, but I think it's something that's percolating in the movement. Again, as progressive Christians become much more interested in the spiritual practices of Christianity, which have never been about dogma and doctrine, ever. The mystics of Christianity didn't care about dogma at all, right? They didn't argue with it, but they weren't preaching it or teaching it. They were talking about how to know God, right? And it seems to me that the big project around communion now is to realize that the elements of communion do have the real presence of the divine in them, right? Panentheism. God is in. The divine is in all things. The divine manifests in all of creation. And that we can celebrate that in the elements of the communion. So they're not, the bread and the wine are not just symbols, as radical reformers like Zwingli said. And they're not the physical body of Christ, like Martin Luther argued against Zwingli. They are elements of nature, and the divine is in that nature, and that we commune with that divinity through these elements as well as through the rest of creation, so that we bring spiritual energy and life back to communion and not just think of it as something symbolic. We go deeper with it. But that's me talking. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion.
It's about time to close.
Gotta get out of here.
Are they still knocking on your door in order to get you to come out to preach right now?
We'll be soon.
Well, I want to thank you
Oh,
on behalf of us and our church for this. I find this really fascinating. I thought I knew a lot about the history of progressive Christianity, but I learned a lot today as well. It would be interesting to have a group like this discuss where are we on the scale of being a progressive Christian community. Yeah.
A lot of ways, it's not one simple thing. There's a lot of room there. A pleasure being with you again. I can't wait to get back with you in person.
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. Take care of yourself.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yes.